The mighty king meets his final enemy. Power collapses in many ways, but few so grotesque as the demise of King Philip II of Spain. For a man who once commanded the greatest empire the world had ever seen, his final enemy proved to be neither rebellious nobles nor rival monarchs, but something far more insidious: his own decaying flesh. It is the summer of 1598. The Escorial Palace, a granite colossus of austere design, looms over the Castilian plains. Philip himself had commissioned it decades earlier, fusion of monastery, mausoleum, and royal residence. It was intended as a monument to Spanish triumph, a sanctuary of faith and power carved in stone. Yet now, its endless corridors and shadowed chambers are suffused with a very different presence. They are about to become a theater of decay, a royal mausoleum even before the king has drawn his last breath. Philip II stood as the most powerful monarch of his age, the master of an empire so vast that chroniclers boasted the sun never sets upon his dominions. His reach stretched from the mines of Mexico to the Philippines, from the ports of Seville to the strongholds of Italy and Flanders. He was the son of Emperor Charles V, heir to both the Habsburg and Spanish crowns, and the man who shouldered the mission of defending Catholic Christendom in an age of fracture and reform. His reign was marked by both splendor and blood. He launched the mighty Armada against England, championed the Inquisition's fire against heresy, and poured Spain's immense wealth into wars meant to preserve the true faith. For decades, he ruled with the certainty of divine favor, convinced that God had entrusted him with nothing less than the guardianship of Christian orthodoxy itself. And yet, for all his grandeur, Philip's last battle would not be fought on foreign fields, but within the confines of his own chamber. For 52 days, in the suffocating heat of a Spanish summer, the man who had wielded armies and fleets would lie trapped in a body that was rotting alive. His flesh, once clothed in robes of state, became prey to parasites and corruption. This story is not merely about suffering, though the suffering was immense. It is about the collapse of illusion, the revelation of what power cannot command. In these last weeks, Philip would discover that kings are not exempt from the universal law of mortality. All the wealth of the Indies, all the faith and ceremony of Catholic Spain could not buy him an easier passage into death. Those who witnessed his decline left accounts so harrowing that historians once doubted them. Surely, it was said, such horrors must have been exaggerated by enemies or dramatized by scandalous rumor. But modern medicine has confirmed their plausibility. The gangrenous sores, the parasites, the festering wounds, all of it rings grimly true. The irony is as sharp as a knife. The Escorial, which Philip had built as both a royal residence and his intended tomb, would indeed become his final stage. Within its stone walls, the most formal court in Europe dissolved into chaos as attendants struggled to care for a monarch who could no longer care for himself. Here, the man who dictated the fates of millions would find himself utterly powerless. No command, no decree, no act of faith could slow the advance of death within him. It is here, in this palace of cold stone and oppressive heat, that we begin our journey into the final days of Philip II. We are about to witness the collapse of flesh and power alike, a story not of armies and empires, but of ulcers and insects, of a king who became a feast for creatures smaller than the smallest of his subjects, a memento mori more terrible than any painted skull or whispered sermon. The curtain rises in spring 1598. Philip is already weakened by years of illness. The first signs of his final decline are stirring in his body. The king of half the world, the architect of Spanish might, is about to enter a battle in which he has no command, and this time there will be no victory. The first cracks in the monarch's flesh the spring of 1598 found Philip, at 71 years of age, old man by the standards of his century, but not merely aged, ruined by pain. For decades, his body had been a battlefield. Gout had claimed him early, twisting his fingers into crooked claws and inflaming his feet until every step felt like walking upon burning stones. The once proud king, who had signed orders that moved armies across Europe, often needed a servant's arm to move across his own chamber. This disease, torment of kings fed by rich diets and sedentary lives, had pursued him without mercy since his 30s. By the 1590s, it was joined by arthritis, so severe that courtiers whispered he could no longer raise his hand, even to scratch his head. His bones ached as if rusted, his joints swollen and useless. He was already confined to a wheelchair by 1591, yet, even then, he worked tirelessly, hunched over documents, scribbling marginal notes with a trembling hand. He still clung to the daily rhythm of rulership, as though sheer will might outpace the collapse of his flesh. This iron devotion to duty was legendary. Visitors to court marveled at his persistence. The monarch, who ruled half the globe, refused to delegate his burdens. He redispatches himself, agonized over details others would have left to ministers. Often his response came as a single, devastating word: no. One stroke of his pen could determine the lives of thousands. But that spring, his resolve collided with a new, merciless decline. By June, waves of fever swept through his body, leaving him delirious and weak. His joints flared with fresh agony. Then came the first visible signs of a deeper corruption, abscesses swelling upon his right knee and hand. First they seemed ordinary infections, painful but survivable. Yet they burst, drained, and returned with greater fury, filling with pus, multiplying across his limbs. The royal physicians descended upon him, armed with the arsenal of their age. Curas, their tools, seemed more like tortures, bloodletting poultices of herbs, and heated plasters meant to draw out corrupted humors. They drained his veins in the belief that illness was born of imbalance, even as the king's strength ebbed further with every incision. To ease the swelling, they pressed cupping glasses against his skin until it bruised and bled. They smeared his sores with salves laced with substances that burned as they touched raw flesh. It was not healing, it was a grim theater of medicine, played upon a body that was already failing. By midsummer, Philip was bedridden, unable to move without agony. The king who had once imposed the strictest etiquette in Europe, the ruler whom courtiers had approached with hushed reverence, bowing low before his presence, was reduced to dependence. Servants fed him, cleaned him, carried away his waste when they could not reach him quickly enough. The ruler of half the world lay soiled in his own excrement. For Philip, whose court was famed for its rigid dignity, this humiliation was an agony of its own. Spain's monarch had been a distant, unapproachable figure, his face rarely seen in casual expression, his words weighed like sacred relics. Now, stripped of ceremony, he lay in a chamber where formality gave way to the raw functions of flesh. He could command fleets, but not his bowels. He could shape dynasties, but not his own hand. And still, the ordeal deepened. Each day, his wounds spread. Each day, his fevers climbed. The stone walls of the Escorial trapped the summer heat, turning his chamber into a furnace. Attendants whispered prayers as they tended to him, but whispers could not mask the growing truth. The most powerful man in Christendom was becoming a prisoner inside his own body. The cracks had opened, and through them came the stench of something far darker. A palace of rot, the king becomes a prisoner of his body. By July, the great palace of the Escorial had become something it was never meant to be. Not a monument to faith and empire, but a prison of disease. Within its vast halls, the smell of corruption began to spread. At first, it lingered only in the king's chamber, an odor of sour sweat and festering wounds. But soon it crept beyond the thick oak doors, seeping into corridors, clinging to the air. forcing courtiers to press perfumed cloths to their faces as they passed by. The king's sores multiplied without end. Abscesses blossomed across his chest, his groin, his legs. They would swell, rupture, ooze, and then reform, as though his body itself had become a factory of rot. Attendants struggled to change his linens quickly enough, but the heat of the Castilian summer turned damp sheets into swamps of infection. Every shift of his wasted frame left a stain behind. Etiquette. Once the fortress of Philip's court collapsed under the weight of necessity. This was a man who had demanded elaborate bows from his nobles, who had choreographed his court with near monastic rigidity. Now, stripped of power, he was tended like an infant. Servants bent over him, not in reverence, but to clean the filth from his skin, to dab the sores that never healed. At times, when his bedding could not be changed swiftly, the King of Spain lay in his own waste. The humiliation was unbearable, and yet there was no choice. Flesh had stripped dignity from the sovereign, and then came the invaders. The lice appeared in early August, first as an irritation, then as a plague. They thrived in the folds of his damp sheets, in the heat of his unwashed body, in the pus and blood that seeped from his lesions. They crawled across his skin, burrowed into his hair, and feasted on his blood. Witnesses wrote of it in horror. Diego de Yepes, Philip's confessor, claimed the lice seemed to rise from his very wounds, as if the king's body itself had become a nest. Some attendants were tasked solely with picking them from his flesh, collecting them by the handful and lee, to return hours later to find new swarms. One can almost picture it, a monarch who had ruled countenance reduced to a body alive with vermin, his skin crawling with countless parasites. The symbolism was not lost on those who saw him. Philip had long been portrayed as God's anointed, a king so holy that some believed his touch could cure disease. Yet now, in the twilight of his life, he had become the opposite a host, not to miracles, but to lice. A man transformed into living carrion. Even the palace itself seemed to recoil. Perfumes and incense were burned constantly, yet the smell of rot always won. It was said the odor was so strong that visitors to the Escorial could detect it before they entered the king's wing. The air itself seemed poisoned. Through it all, Philip's mind remained cruelly lucid. He knew what was happening. He gave orders to keep the windows shut, not for his own comfort, but so that the stench of his body would not drift outward to offend those beyond his chamber. In this, perhaps, lay the last remnant of his royal pride, that even as his flesh failed him, he would not let the world beyond the door witness the full extent of his collapse. But there was no disguising it. The most powerful man in Europe was rotting while alive, and his palace of triumph had become a hive of corruption. A still worse was yet to come, for the lice were only the beginning. The flies had not yet arrived. When flies claimed the king, the invasion of Magasif lice were the heralds of decay. The flies were its true conquerors. By late August, the sick room had become unbearable. The thick air of the Escorial, already heavy with the sour stench of infection, now drew swarms of insects to the king's chamber. The attendants tried to wave them away, to shut windows, to burn herbs in desperate clouds of smoke. But the palace itself betrayed them. The heat was suffocating. The stone walls radiated warmth, and the smell of rotting flesh was irresistible. The flies came in droves. They crawled across the king's face, settled in the corners of his eyes, drank from the fluids that leaked from his sores. Then they laid their eggs. Within days, the abscesses became breeding grounds. Maggots appeared, pale and writhing, feeding on the decayed tissue of the king's body. The worst of these horrors centered on his right hip. There, an ulcer had grown so vast and deep that one court chronicler described it as the size of a fist. It gaped open, exposing not just skin, but the hidden cavity of his body. Every day, attendants removed pus and rotting matter from the wound enough to fill basins of silver. 2 of them, according to eyewitnesses. Yet, it was never enough. Each morning, new corruption had formed. Within this pit of flesh, the maggots multiplied. Friar Jose de Siguenza, a man of sober character, wrote that when attendants tried to clean the wound, the larvae writhed deeper, burrowing into the meat of their king. Kata, they could not be destroyed. Kata, each day they were removed by the handful, and each day they returned. Soon they were not confined to the hip. The maggots spread to other wounds, emerging from his chest, his legs, even from beneath his fingernails. Flies ventured into his ears, his nose, his mouth, laying their eggs in every cavity they could reach. Some modern historians suggest Philip suffered from myositis, living infestation of fly larvae within the tissues of the body. If true, then the most Catholic king was consumed, not only from without, but from within. Imagine the sight. A monarch, once revered as semi-divine, his subjects convinced that God had chosen him to rule, now lying motionless as worms crawled from his body. His attendants, gagging against the stench, used cloths and spoons to scoop the creatures away. And Philip, still conscious, still painfully aware, could only endure. His gout made every movement a torment. When servants tried to change his position, his screams echoed through the stone halls of the Escorial. The monarch, who had once watched without pity as heretics burned in the plazas of Spain, now begged for mercy from his own servants. Yet through all this agony, his mind remained disturbingly clear. Philip knew exactly what was happening. He watched his body betray him, piece by piece, yet still clung to his faith. Witnesses record him murmuring prayers, seeking comfort in Scripture, reminding himself that his pains were nothing compared to his sins. In the silence of the night, he whispered to God as the vermin feasted upon him, and perhaps this was the cruelest torment of all. A man might endure horrors more easily if delirium shielded him, if madness dulled the edge. But Philip II, the ruler of the first global empire, suffered with full awareness. He could feel the bite of every louse, the burrowing of every maggot. He could smell his own corruption. He knew that his body, once clothed in royal majesty, had become a banquet for worms. The flies had claimed him. The king was still alive, but his body was no longer his own. Faith as the last refuge. By the end of August, the Escorial had become more charnel house than palace. The king's body was collapsing in every direction, its skin breaking open in sores, its flesh consumed by maggots, its fluids seeping into linens that no servant could cleanse quickly enough. And yet, through all of this ruin, one thing remained intact: his mind, and with it, his faith. Each morning, when he had the strength, Philip requested Mass to be celebrated within his chamber. Priests murmured Latin prayers over the stench of rot, swinging censers heavy with incense in a futile attempt to smother the odor. Attendants noted that the smoke mixed with the sweet sick smell of decay until the air itself became suffocating. But Philip never permitted the service to cease. He clung to ritual as if each prayer, each recited psalm, might hold back the tide of corruption, eating him alive in quieter hours. He asked his confessors to read aloud from the works of saints. He listened to the lives of martyrs, perhaps finding in their torments some reflection of his own. He spoke often of sin and of his hope that his agony might at least serve as penance. Lord, he is reported to have whispered, these pains are but small beside my offenses. His faith gave him composure, but not release. For with each week came new afflictions. Persistent diarrhea weakened him further, fouling his bed and forcing his attendants to lift him again, each movement provoking screams as gout set his joints aflame. His abdomen swelled grotesquely with retained fluid, his legs puffed with edema until the skin split under the pressure, creating fresh openings for infection. The physicians could do a little but intensify his suffering. Still bound by humoral theory, they prescribed bloodlettings, sometimes daily, draining vitality from a man already faint with weakness. They smeared his wounds with caustic concoctions of mercury and arsenic meant to draw out corruption, which burned his tissues and accelerated necrosis. They fed him soft bread and broth, food for a child rather than a monarch. Yet even this he often could not keep down. From a modern eye, it was a perfect storm of misfortune. Philip likely suffered from gout and advanced arthritis, perhaps worsened by diabetes. Sepsis coursed through his veins, swelling his body and fevering his mind. His immobility bred pressure sores that tunneled into his flesh, while the heat of summer invited infestation. Every treatment intended to help only worsened his decline. Outside his chamber, the summer sun blazed upon Castile, built of heavy granite, trapped the heat like an oven. Attendants sweated beneath their layers of clothing as they bent to tend him, their faces pale from both exhaustion and the unbearable stench. Within those stone walls, time itself seemed to suffocate. Yet, amid this suffocating world, Philip clung to the role of king. Between bouts of fever and pain, he summoned his son, the future Philip III, to his bedside. He spoke of duty, of empire, of faith. He reminded his heir that earthly power was fragile, and gestured to his own ruined body as the ultimate proof. Here lay the paradox. Philip was at once a monarch disintegrating before his court, and a father, attempting to shape the next reign with the wisdom that could only come from such ruin. His words were soft, his voice failing, but his intent was clear, even as maggots consumed his body. He wanted to ensure that the empire he had built would endure, but Spain itself seemed to hold its breath. Outside the walls of the Escorial, rumors spread of the king's condition. Whispers reached the towns. Their ruler, their guardian of Catholic orthodoxy, was no longer master of himself. His empire stretched across the globe, yet he was prisoner to a bed. His authority mocked by lice and flies. The king's body was a battlefield and faith his only refuge. Yet even faith could not hold back the tide much longer. The first weeks of September were approaching, and with them the shadow of death itself. The last weeks a kingdom in silence. By September of 1598, the court no longer pretended. The king was dying, and all of Spain knew it. Messengers carried the news from the Escorial to Madrid, to Valladolid, to every corner of the empire. In the cities, people gathered in churches, priests led vigils, and bells tolled in a slow, mournful rhythm. Yet, within the thick granite walls of the Escorial, the spectacle of death was not solemn, it was grotesque. Philip's body was unrecognizable. His face, once sharp and severe, had swollen and slackened. His skin had turned a mottled gray, broken by red fissures that oozed. The vast ulcer on his hip had grown so deep that some claimed bone could be glimpsed beneath the pus and rot. Each day, attendants removed matter enough to fill dishes of silver. Still, the wound returned, as though his flesh itself had turned into an inexhaustible spring of corruption. The maggots thrived. So numerous were they that even the priests who prayed beside his bed could not ignore them. Eyewitnesses describe attendants plucking larvae from his skin by the handful, only to see more writhing within hours. When the king moved when he could be moved, maggots dropped from his body to the stone floor below. Flies buzzed ceaselessly about his chamber, thick as smoke. The air was so tainted that courtiers could not linger long without gagging. And yet, amid this degradation, the machinery of monarchy persisted. Secretaries still brought him documents. His trembling hands, their fingers twisted by gout, still attempted to sign decrees. Sometimes he could only trace a wavering mark, yet even this was witnessed with reverence, as if the act itself imbued the document with sovereign will. The empire still revolved around the dying sun at its center, but Philip's voice was no longer the voice of an emperor, right? Was the voice of a penitent. Again and again he asked for prayers, for relics to be brought near his bed. He kept before him the crucifix that had once belonged to his father, Charles V, the same crucifix that had comforted the emperor when he, too, died in a haze of sickness decades earlier. Philip clutched it as though by grasping his father's relic he might bridge the abyss between life and eternity. In these weeks, he endured what chroniclers called agonious seizures of pain, so violent that his cries echoed through the palace. The gout stabbed at his joints, the ulcers burned, his bowels betrayed him, his swollen body struggled to breathe. At times, his attendants believed the end had come, only for him to rally, whispering prayers through cracked lips. But it was not only the body that decayed. The legend of Philip the distant, majestic, untouchable monarch was itself unraveling. No longer hidden behind ceremony, the king's body was exposed as human, frail, riddled with vermin. The court watched the slow destruction of the man who had governed half the world, and in their silence lay both pity and unease. Still, Philip did not falter in faith. "All is vanity," he murmured, echoing Ecclesiastes, "save to serve God." His pain, he declared, was a final test, a fire to cleanse his soul. Whether these words were strength or resignation, none could say. The silence of September deepened. Each day, priests offered mass within the chamber. Each day, the empire crept closer to losing its monarch. Outside, autumn winds began to stir across Castile. Inside, the air of the Escorial hung heavy with incense and the odor of a king who was already half a corpse. The end was near, and all of Spain waited for the moment when the body that had been devoured by lice, flies, and worms would finally be surrendered to the grave. The death of Philip Ion, the night of September 12, 1598, the king's strength faltered at last. For weeks he had clung to life with a tenacity that astonished his physicians. But now the signs of final collapse were unmistakable. His pulse was faint, his breathing shallow, his skin cold despite the oppressive heat of the chamber. Those who entered knew they were witnessing the last hours of a monarch who had ruled the first global empire. The room was crowded, priests chanting low prayers, friars with relics in hand, secretaries standing silent, courtiers weeping softly. The stench was unbearable, but none dared leave. To be present at the king's passing was both a duty and a privilege. Philip himself, though racked by pain, remained conscious until almost the end. He clutched tightly the crucifix of his father, Charles V, pressing it to his chest. At intervals, he whispered prayers, the Credo, the Pater Noster, the names of the saints. His lips moved slowly, cracked and dry. The words were clear enough for those nearby to record. As dawn approached, he summoned his son, the future Philip III, to his side. Witnesses recalled the moment with awe. The father, his body ruined, his voice little more than a whisper, imparting his last counsels to the son who would inherit both crown and empire. "Hold fast to the faith," he murmured. "Serve God above all." It was less a political testament than a spiritual one, the final breath of a king who saw his sufferings as the price of salvation. By midday on September 13th, the struggle was almost over. His body, grotesquely swollen, emitted fluids with every labored breath. The ulcers festered openly. Worms writhed in the folds of his sheets. He was already half in the grave, yet his mind clung to prayer. When at last his strength gave way, he fixed his gaze upon the crucifix. With what little air remained to him, he whispered, in Manus tuas Domini, "Into thy hands, O Lord, I'll sigh." The silence that followed was immense. 40 days of unspeakable torment, the most Catholic king had breathed his last. Priests intoned the De Profundis. Courtiers knelt in reverence. The empire, for the first time in more than 4 decades, was without its master. Yet death did not erase the horror of his end. His attendants, forced to prepare the body, found it nearly unmanageable, bloated, infested, riddled with sores. They struggled to dress him in royal garments, to mask the corruption with perfumes and incense. Even in death, the king's body refused dignity. Still, Spain buried him with grandeur. His coffin was carried in solemn procession, draped in black and gold, accompanied by endless prayers. Within the Escorial, the palace monastery he himself had built, Philip II was entombed beside his father, the Emperor Charles V. And so ended the reign of a man who had ruled from Madrid to Manila, from Naples to the New World, a king who had sent armadas, toppled kingdoms, and wielded faith as both sword and shield. His empire seemed eternal, but his body, like all bodies, had been reduced to carrion, feasted upon by lice, flies, and worms. To his subjects, his death was a lesson. To some, it proved his sanctity, that he had borne suffering with patience, like a martyr. To others, it revealed the vanity of earthly power, that even the mightiest ruler could be devoured by corruption while still alive. Philip II had wanted the Escorial to be a monument to both monarchy and faith. In the end, it became the stage for his long, grotesque martyrdom, warning carved not in stone, but in flesh. The corpse of a king's funeral, horse death, did not end the ordeal of Philip II, for those charged with preparing his body. The true nightmare was only beginning. The attendants who approached the corpse recoiled almost immediately. His body was grotesquely swollen, his limbs stiffened in unnatural angles by gout, his skin discolored from gray to green-black. The ulcers, which in life had poured corruption, now ruptured further, releasing foul matter. Maggots spilled freely from the cavities where they had bred for weeks. No perfumes of Castile, no clouds of incense, could disguise the stench that rolled through the chamber. Custom demanded that a king's body be washed, dressed in royal finery, and displayed for the court. But Philip's corpse resisted dignity. When attendants tried to move him, the bloated skin split, leaking fluids across the linens. His fingers, gnarled and stiff, could scarcely be forced into the gloves of ceremony. His face, distorted by swelling, could not be masked entirely, even under powders and perfumes. Chroniclers note that courtiers wept, not only from grief, but from the revolting sight of their monarch reduced to such a state. Still, ritual prevailed. The corpse was dressed in cloth of gold, the crucifix of Charles V placed in his hands. The body was laid in state within the Escorial, candles burning, priests chanting endless psalms. Courtiers and commoners alike came to pay homage, many holding cloths to their faces against the suffocating odor. Some whispered that to endure such a stench was itself an act of devotion, a penance for those who came to honor their king. From the Escorial, the coffin was carried in solemn procession. Bells tolled, banners hung black, soldiers marched with heads bowed. The people of Spain, though shielded from the worst of the truth, knew that their king had suffered like no other. For some, this was proof of sanctity that God had chosen him to endure torments as a martyr. For others, it was a terrible reminder that earthly power, even one ruling half the world, could not protect against the humiliations of death. The coffin was entombed in the pantheon of the Escorial, beneath the very monastery palace Philip had built as his monument. There he was laid beside his father, Charles V, and among the marble vaults that would later hold generations of Spanish kings. But whispers lingered. Those who had seen the body spoke of worms that still crawled within the coffin, of an odor that clung even after burial. In sermons, preachers described his death as an image of the vanity of earthly greatness. Behold, they told their congregations, the man who ruled the world, now food for worms. And yet, for others, the horror became a kind of sanctification. Philip's patience, his unbroken piety, his whispered prayers in the midst of unthinkable agony, these were held as proof of divine favor. The king had suffered like Job, like a saint tested in fire. Some whispered he had already earned his place in heaven. Thus, the death of Philip II became legend, both a spectacle of decay and a sermon on faith, both a warning against pride and an example of endurance. His empire would endure under his son, Philip III, but never again would Spain forget the sight of a king devoured in his own bed, leaving behind a body too foul to honor and a memory too terrible to erase.